Okay, we are live now. So, hi everyone. My name is Madeline Dyer, and I am a YA fiction writer, personal essayist, and poet. I'm joined today by Laura Zam, the author of The Pleasure Plan, which released earlier this week. We're going to be interviewing each other about our works. And now this is a live video stream to YouTube. So if you're watching it live as we're talking and you want to ask us a question, all you need to do is leave it in a comment in the live chat facility that's on the same page as this video. And then Laura and I will be able to see your questions and answer them live. So it's a good way to engage with sort of a live Q&A session. So welcome, Laura. Firstly, do you want to introduce yourself before we get started with the questions about your book?
Sure. So my name is Laura Zam, and I am a sexuality educator, a certified trauma professional, and a women's health advocate. And my specialty is talking about women's sexual healing.
Yeah, I certainly got that impression, just the sort of like extent of your expertise from reading your memoir. So,
Great.
Yeah. So yeah, firstly, do you want to tell the audience a little about your book?
Sure. So The Pleasure Plan is a self-help memoir. It is the journey of my ability to overcome what in the book I call every hoo-ha hang-up in the DSM, by which I mean 6 different kinds of sexual dysfunction, including those associated with trauma. I go on a journey in the book to heal and also save my new marriage by visiting 15 different kinds of practitioners and trying 30 different healing modalities. And in the end, I am successful. But I also learn a lot about women's sexuality.
Okay. Yeah, I really liked how your book just covered a lot of different sort of things. Although it's like mainly focused on sexual healing and sexuality, it covers such a wide array of like other things. It's about your marriage as well and your family. It's got like this feminism sort of like line running through the whole book. So yeah, what inspired you to write about your sexual health and healing in such an intimate way?
It is an intimate way. What inspired me was that when I went on the journey, I found that most of the practitioners that I encountered, both in the behavioral health field and in the medical field, did not know anything about women's sexual function and response. They knew it from a medical perspective, perhaps, but not from a pleasure perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became very interested and I guess kind of angry that there wasn't better information out there for women about our own bodies, our responsiveness, and our sexual health. And so I took it upon myself to go on a mission to get information out, especially for women like me who felt very broken and did not know even how to begin to heal from these issues, which can be very, very complex for probably most of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's obviously very personal to you, and it is very much experience-based. So the book details about how you tried several different healing methods, and you actually tried 30 different healing methods in this book. So what worked the least?
What worked the least was a kind of condemnation where I start the book with a therapist, a psychotherapist, who advises me to just have sex with my husband so he doesn't leave me, and that I shouldn't even attempt to heal myself sexually because I probably just don't have that ability. I'm just inherently not sexual, which could certainly be the case. But in my case, I really wanted to heal from these past wounds and to rediscover or discover for the first time this part of myself. It wasn't for her to decide whether or not I had the capacity to have more sexual feelings. So that worked the least.
Yeah, I definitely got that impression, like from reading that section of the book, because that's sort of like what really spurs you on to look at all the other different healing methods that were available.
Right.
So which one of those worked the best and why?
Well, it wasn't just one that worked the best, but it was actually two different avenues, I'd say, worked the best. One was being able to get a very specific diagnosis for my problems, to understand specifically what it was that was going on and what I could possibly fix even, or address in a way, manage, for instance. So that was one avenue. And the other avenue was getting great sex ed from people who were also on a mission to get good information out to women about their sexuality. So I saw a tantrika. I took a workshop with a woman named Betty Dodson, who is 91 right now, and she's still doing these pleasure workshops with women they're naked, but they're phenomenal and very, very, very responsible.
Yeah. Yeah, your book, I'll admit, it like opened me up to a lot of different sort of like medical professionals and different ways of approaching sort of sexual health and sexual well-being that I wasn't aware of. So it was a really enlightening read for me, just because it was just like a lot of new information. And although like some of the sort of issues that you talked about in your book are things I've come across before, I hadn't sort of like seen anyone talk so openly and honestly about these issues. And like I know that trauma also plays a part in your narrative, a history of childhood sexual abuse. So how did this history affect your sexual development and health?
It affected it profoundly. I was abused when I was very, very young. I didn't know what the effects were until I began to become sexual in my late teens, and I was not able to have penetrative sex with my boyfriend. I didn't know what that was about. I even went to a doctor. She told me to have wine and relax, which is also bad advice that women are still given this to this day. And so I had this undiagnosed condition, which is called vaginismus, or hypertonic pelvic floor syndrome. And it's basically a muscle spasm. It's overly tight and weak pelvic floor muscles. So I absorbed the trauma in my body in a way where my body said no. That was one way that the trauma affected me. And it also is interwoven into who I am. It's really even hard to understand what it is. But, you know, like many trauma survivors, I have different issues having to do with power. And this book was really helpful for me to take my power back and to document that, because I think that trauma is fundamentally an event of powerlessness, and often power is the antidote.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the act of writing a memoir is like very much about sort of claiming your story, and like it's empowering just to write about these sort of things, especially when it's such an intimate and personal subject matter. So you're really sort of like owning it by exploring it in a memoir form.
Yeah.
So why do you think it is so difficult for women to get good medical help?
You know what, man, sorry, I forgot to turn my little light on. And so there's like weird light in my I'm gonna turn my, oh, here we go. Sorry about that. I'm coming right back here. Oops, daisies, there we go. Okay. Okay. There we are. That's a little bit better. Good. Sorry about that. All right. Yeah, that's better light. Wow, right. The question was, why do I think that it is difficult for women to get help with regard to their sexual health, right?
Yeah.
Yes. It's difficult because it's really difficult to talk about. I started the journey so ashamed. I had these issues for 30 years. I self-diagnosed myself with this pelvic floor condition, which is only one of the 6 different kinds of dysfunction that I had. But I felt so embarrassed to talk to my gynecologist, whom I'd been seeing for 10 years, and to come in and all of a sudden say, oh, by the way, I have this condition. I think I self-diagnosed myself. And this is really the norm, that women do feel ashamed to talk to anyone, even their medical providers. There are statistics that say 6 or 7% of women, for instance, who have menopausal or postmenopausal conditions, often painful sex and different kinds of problems associated with that, only 6 or 7% are getting any kind of treatment. We're just not talking about it because of shame. I think also women tend to blame themselves when we have issues, and the medical profession doesn't necessarily take us seriously, as we've been talking about. And so I guess we know that that might be the case. We're not going to be taken seriously, so we don't even try, or we do try and we get bad advice, or we're shut down, and then we don't continue.
Yeah, like I know we have talked a lot previously in different discussions to this one about sexism in the medical like place, and like because we both had experiences where we've been sort of like almost treated as just hysterical.
Right.
And yeah, and because like hysteria is still like, although it's not sort of like a diagnosis that you'll get now, you do find medical professionals are still biased towards women, and especially towards women's problems.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
yeah. So if readers could take away one thing from your book, what would it be?
That pleasure matters. It matters because we matter. It doesn't have to be sexual pleasure. It can be any kind of pleasure, but that as women, it really does. It's important that we have a great experience on this earth being alive. And I think for millennia, women were conditioned to believe that we're not entitled to that. We're not entitled to the same amount of good feeling as men are. And so I'd love for my readers to feel that they really can take pleasure, and in this case, their sexual health, into their own hands, and do so because they're worth it.
Yeah, and your book, one thing I was noticing when I was reading it, it's like mainly memoir and like your experiences, but it has got these like workbook sections at the end of each chapter, and I haven't come across that in a memoir before, but it really sort of spoke to me and like showed me how one of the main goals of you sort of producing this book is to help other women with these sort of same sort of or similar problems.
Yes.
And yeah, what made you decide to include like these workbook sections where it's like becoming very interactive?
Yeah, I sold my book to a self-help publisher, and it's HCI. It's a fantastic publisher. It's actually a life issues publisher, and that's their specialty, and that's their mission, is to put out books into the world that help people in their own personal development. And so right away, we were figuring out a way that we could maybe include information there that would tap into my expertise as a sexuality educator. And that was one way that was the solution we came up with, not to interrupt the narrative or to minimize the narrative, but to just add this adjunct. And I'm happy with it. So
yeah, it works very well, and it's very effective when you're reading it, because it really reminds us that like, although it's your memoir, it's a problem and like issues and these feelings that you are experiencing that a lot of women are going to be experiencing. So it does sort of like open it up quite a bit in that respect.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, we're up to 14 minutes now.
Okay.
So
all right. So it is my pleasure now to interview Madeline Dyer about her fantastic, fantastic poetry collection, which I enjoyed reading so much over the weekend, Captive. And so I'm wondering what inspired you to write a whole poetry collection about your mental health journey.
okay, so this is the book here. I keep forgetting where the camera is. Yeah, so that's my poetry collection, Captive. And it's actually a bit of a strange book in terms of inspiration, because I never sort of set out to write a poetry collection about my experiences with mental health. It just sort of happened. So the individual poems in this book are based on the therapy writings I did when suffering from acute brain inflammation that then caused severe OCD. This is because the part of the brain that was really inflamed for me was the basal ganglia, and that is the part responsible for habit formation and emotion, among other things. So I literally woke up one day and I suddenly had severe OCD, whereas I'd never had any signs of this disorder before. So that was quite a shock. And I was also hallucinating. I was convinced everything was covered in sand and that there were birds flying around me all the time. The inflammation caused a loss of balance and I couldn't stand up straight. And then I just kept falling over. And as this progressed onward, I eventually sort of was unable to communicate verbally what I was feeling. And it was a very, very confusing and very frustrating time, especially when it took 6 months for doctors to diagnose me correctly, because at first they just said I had just had normal OCD, but it didn't explain the loss of balance and all the other symptoms. And it was only when I was struggling to communicate verbally that they then agreed to do a brain scan. And they then sort of trialed me on the treatment for brain inflammation, and we found it improved it massively. So it was really when I had this inability to communicate and all these sort of cognitive effects of the brain inflammation that it just spurred me to start writing out my feelings. Because due to the illness's effect on my brain, I couldn't write my fiction anymore. And that's my full-time job as a YA fiction writer. But I still needed to feel like I was a writer when all this was going on, as that's a huge part of my identity. So I turned to poetry, because I didn't consciously sit down and think, oh, I'm gonna choose a new form to write. It just happened, and I can't really explain the thought process behind it. But these poems were written as therapy poems, purely to help me process everything that I was experiencing, as it was a pretty dark time. And yeah, when I began treatment and started the long process of recovery, I showed a few people these poems, and they said how enlightening it was, just to sort of get this insight into how I'd been feeling. And then I eventually decided to release the poetry collection as a way to raise awareness for these disorders.
Yeah, and I think that it raises awareness for so many different kinds of mental health struggles and also health struggles. I certainly identified with it as somebody who had gone on this journey, a very, very different kind of medical journey, but so many similarities in terms of trying to be understood and get help and understand our own bodies.
Yeah, exactly.
So Captive covers some dark themes, and the reviewers have commented upon this, apparently. And they said that it's not an enjoyable read. So how do you process that as a writer?
Well, it is a dark collection, and it's not meant to be enjoyed in that respect. I have seen those reviews, and they talk about how there's not much of a plot often as well. And I think it's mainly because they know me as a fiction writer. So they're just so used to me writing fiction. And then they just saw my new book and didn't really sort of think about how different it would be. So they're sort of trying to read my poetry collection as if it's a novel. I think that's sort of thrown up some interesting questions, because Captive is aimed at a very different audience, and it wasn't written to entertain. Because my fiction novels and my YA writing, they're written to pretty much entertain. That is sort of the primary purpose. Although I do want to sort of have messages sort of coming across with my fiction. But Captive was originally written as therapy writing to help me process everything I was feeling. And it was published in order to raise awareness. So it's very different goals. And yeah, there do seem to be sort of two camps that these reviews are falling into, where if people are new to me completely and they just pick up my poetry collection, they seem to get a lot more from it than my YA readers, who are then picking up this poetry collection perhaps because they recognize my name. So yeah, it's sort of there's two very different ways that people seem to be approaching this poetry collection. And I hadn't anticipated that some people would be trying to sort of read it and read a plot into it. And although the collection, the poems in it are ordered chronologically, So you can see the progression as like I'm getting
There
sort of like
there is a narrative in there, but it's not like fiction. There's just your journey and the way it
exactly.
unfolds.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually, the idea of the doctor coming in and saying, "Okay, I've got this figured out." It sounds almost like some reviewers, they say, "Okay, I know what this is," without just experiencing it fresh, or even just reading the synopsis to understand what it is, so that they could critique it in a way that was appropriate. So writing about anything personal does make us vulnerable. I know that as well. Were you worried about publishing something about so private?
Yeah, so I was so worried because my disorder did cause psychosis and hallucinations. I have faced a lot of stigma around that, and like some people no longer speak to me in the same way that they used to. So I have noticed a difference, but a lot of it is sort of like due to fear, and I think it's mainly because like in popular culture, when you have like psychosis appearing in sort of films, especially older films, it's used as a plot device where it's sort of used to add to sort of the villain or an antagonist, and it's used in a way to make them more scary or more violent or sort of like more unreliable. And it's very much you've got sort of like this juxtaposition going on in a lot of these films where you've got like the good guy sort of like mentally stable and then the bad guy is unstable. So I think that does contribute towards sort of like current stigma around mental health as well, especially when you don't, well, mental health still isn't really talked about that openly as it should be. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about mental health. And yes, I was really worried about publishing this collection, and because the poems sort of like detail like some pretty dark thoughts that I was having, and like all the confusion and just how real like the hallucinations were to me. Because like when I was hallucinating and I was convinced that birds were flying around in my room, it felt so realistic. And I had no idea that they weren't real. And I spent hours trying to catch these birds. And in the end, one of my family had to come and stop me because I was just getting too upset because I just could not catch this bird. But like now, if I go outside and I see a bird flying around, I don't know whether I'm hallucinating or not because I can't sort of like trust myself in that way.
Wow.
So it could be a hallucination or it could be real. So yeah, I was worried about publishing the collection because I didn't want others like reading it and judging me and treating me differently. But it was also like difficult to decide to release the private therapy writings into this like public sphere, as these writings were very much a safe space to explore my feelings. And when I wrote them, no one was supposed to read them because it was just like written for me. And it does make me very vulnerable having this out there. And yeah, I do worry about people I know reading it, like family and friends. And I have felt ashamed at times about some of the dark stuff I wrote. But I know it is important for it to be out there because it's raising awareness for these conditions. So.
And did you find that as well, that some people were really grateful that you had talked about something that it can be so shameful for people?
Yeah, so I was contacted by a mental health nurse from the States because I'm in the UK, and she said that she read my collection and she just found it really, she didn't say it was enjoyable, but she found it really powerful, and she said it helped her sort of relate better to some of her patients. And she said it's like we need to sort of bridge this gap between what we think someone's feeling when they're mentally ill and what they could actually be feeling. And she said that my poetry collection really helped her understand sort of different ways in which these subtype of OCD that I had can manifest. Because I had contamination-based OCD, but it also manifested as this huge fear of birds, and I don't know why. But that was then what my hallucinations fed into. And writing these poems, and particularly when I was editing them, I was really able to like delve into the connections between my OCD and the hallucinations I was experiencing in the psychosis revolving around birds. So yeah, this mental health nurse said that she found it really informative for her to read it, and she said it would help her with future patients that she had who were also having like hallucinations or OCD.
Yeah. And anytime I read anything so personal, and particularly when I was reading your poetry collection, I feel like it empowers me. It empowers me to let go of my shame and to, right, to be myself in the world, as imperfect as I may be, and to not feel like I have to hide anything that I'm going through. So that was a gift. I think your book is such a gift.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think you talked about how you made this transition. Do you think you're going to continue to write poetry, or do you think that this was only part of this one experience?
I don't want to rule it out and say that I'm not going to write any more poetry, but at the moment, another poetry collection is unlikely. I mean, I'm actually working on a full-length memoir about like the whole journey that I've been through, and like with all the wider context. And I need a much longer word count in order to tell that story in the way that I need to. And like the memoir as a genre will allow me to be sort of more analytical about what I've experienced and really help me process it all. Like poetry was really the form that I needed at the early stages of my recovery. So now, like what I need to do now is really go into detail about this illness and examine it in a way that allows me to discover more. Like the poetry, I did enjoy writing it, and I enjoyed, well, I mean, I didn't enjoy writing it at the time, but I mean, when I was working on the revisions, I enjoyed it to be sort of on the level that I was then able to understand myself more, because I actually lost a lot of my memory of the actual time when my brain was inflamed. So having sort of like the poetry does provide a written sort of report about what I was feeling. And I found that really helpful to read. But yeah, I mean, if my brain inflammation does get worse again, then I may very well go back to writing poetry, because I know that that form does allow me to express myself creatively and hold on to my identity as a writer if I can't actually communicate verbally anymore.
What is the prognosis?
So it's a long-term condition, but there's so little known about it. So at the moment, I have experienced sort of like follow-up flares from like the main sort of like acute episode. So I get those about every 2 to 3 months. But we are looking at sort of like more long-term treatments like plasmapheresis and IVIG, which is about resetting the immune system, because the type of brain inflammation I have is autoimmune basal ganglia encephalitis. It's also referred to as PANS in children, which is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric disorder. And it's basically where if you get an infection or something, your body would produce antibodies against it to fight it off. But the antibodies that it produces get misdirected and they attack the brain instead. So a lot of the treatments are very much sort of about resetting the immune system and sort of like reprogramming it so it doesn't do that, and building up a stronger blood-brain barrier. So yeah, I mean, the brain inflammation that I had has actually caused a brain cyst as well in me, which showed up on my most recent brain scan. So we're sort of like keeping an eye on that, because we're not sure whether this cyst itself is going to make the inflammation worse at times, because it's a bit of an unknown. And there's not a lot of sort of like reports on this because it's very rarely diagnosed. But there is a lot of speculation that a lot of people who have got sort of like rapid onset OCD, where it literally develops overnight, have actually got this form of brain inflammation.
That makes sense. So the memoir then will talk about all this, what's happened, and also we'll be able to capture this ongoing treatment and management and all of that.
Yeah, and it definitely allows me to be sort of like more analytical and more critical, and examining it all through like multiple lenses. And I have been interviewing a lot of different people for this memoir as well, because as I said earlier, I've got like these gaps in my memory, and I'm trying to be sort of as objective as possible in this memoir. So for the places where I can't remember what's happened, I've like pieced together the narrative by interviewing other people, looking at different medical documents and doing a lot of research. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's very useful for me because I learn a lot more about the illness as well from speaking to like those around me. So, because I get sort of a different viewpoint, and I think it's important just to like include, well, I'm including absolutely everything at this stage, because until I've finished the first draft, and I'm hoping the first draft is going to sort of finish at a point where I'm sort of like having some of the long-term treatment. But until I've got to that point, I won't know which are the significant points, like which parts to keep in the first draft. So at the moment, absolutely everything is going into this first draft of the memoir, because then afterwards I can decide which bits are the important bits to keep.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it'll also be a gift for people to be able to follow this and to not feel their shame around these issues and all kinds of mental health issues. So I'll ask you the same question. What do you hope that readers take away from your collection?
I think just sort of like a better sort of like awareness of mental health issues, because although my mental health experiences have been caused by brain inflammation, the OCD that I developed is pretty similar to more regular forms of OCD. And I know, like, I have had people contact me who have OCD and just contacted me to say that they could relate to so much of what I'd written. So I think, like, one thing that I want people to sort of like take away from my book is a like better understanding of what it means to suffer from poor mental health, and so that they can be like kinder to other people, and to sort of like take away the stigma that is very much attached to mental health.
Well, I think that's a great place to end our interview.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for interviewing me and obviously joining me on this live broadcast. So,
And thank you. This was a real pleasure.
so yeah, yeah, your book released earlier this week, didn't it? So,
Yeah, on May the 5th, on Tuesday. And when does your poetry collection come out? In January, you said?
yeah, it was out on January the 14th. So
Okay.
it's been out for a few months now. But yeah, on the description for this YouTube video, I'll add links to where you can buy both our books and find out more information about both of us.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.